Hello Netrunner fans. Today we're going to be looking at 10 cards that I would like to see reprinted from original Netrunner. This is not intended to be like a top 10 list or an evaluation of best cards from original Netrunner. I pretty much just picked cards that I thought had interesting mechanics or would somehow fit into the modern game's metagame. So this is really just cards that I find interesting I'd like to see reprinted. The first card on the list is by far the most vanilla and maybe boring. This is a piece of ice called Laser Wire. It's a 4-res 2-strength barrier with 2 subroutines, do 1 net damage, and end the run. The original game had quite a few of these end the run barriers that dealt damage at a variety of sizes, and this is one of the lower end ones. In the modern game, we've only really seen this sort of thing with Wall of Thorns, which I think we can agree is an overcosted and just not really up to par large high-end barrier. I'd like to see some more mid-range, smaller barrier that has this damage effect. I think that would really help, especially like PE and some of the other damage-oriented Jinteki decks. But given how strong a lot of the other barriers are, especially like Eli and Wraparound and things like that, I think this would have to be better than the printed version in original Netrunner. So I would instead make the first subroutine a when encountered effect. So basically when they encounter it, they take a damage, and then it still has end the run. I could see this seeing play in a wide variety of Jinteki decks. Not only would it be good in PE, because you'd be able to consolidate one of your end the run effects with a taxing sort of damage effect as well. It would also maybe be good in RP. You can't really face check it without getting poked, and it's a nice little cheap end the run barrier if you need something like that. The other thing about this is that it doesn't get totally invalidated with Corroder, which is a big problem for lower end barriers. I think this would still be worth the 4 cost once they got a Corroder in play, because win and counter effects are just so strong. The next card is called Power Grid Overload. It's an X cost operation, it's gray ops. You can play it only if the runner is tagged, and you trash X non-cybernetics pieces of hardware. This is pretty obviously a Weyland card, and I think it fits into an area of the Weyland card pool that could use some expansion. That's tag punishment effects. Now that's kind of weird to say in a faction that has Scorched Earth, which is pretty obviously the best tag punishment card in the game. But as I've talked about before, NBN is just much better at the flatline Scorched Earth decks, and I think if Weyland had another influence-intensive tag punishment card that would be really difficult to play in NBN, we might see a resurgence of more tag and bag oriented Weyland decks. Once you get them tagged, this is pretty much you pay 1 cost to kill their console, and then you might be able to kill additional cards as well. We definitely have to change the subtype that was not affected by this card. There aren't enough playable cybernetics. In fact, I think they're all terrible outside of Net-Ready Eyes. So I think it would make a lot more sense to change the subtype to Gear. The big thing about Gear is that it would miss Plascrete Carapace, which is easily the best way to deal with Scorched. But it would also miss things like Prepaid Voice Pad and some of the net damage prevention effects. And I think it would be pretty healthy to have a card that could kill normal awesome pieces of hardware like consoles, but wouldn't be able to just easily deal with Plascrete. It would also carve out an area of the design space where you'd be able to print new cards similar to Plascrete and not have to worry about them getting crushed by this thing. I'd really like to see Weyland get better ways to destroy both programs and hardware, and some powerful operation like this, even if it's based on tag punishment, would be a really nice addition to their card pool. The next card has a terrible name, as did many cards from original Netrunner. This is Gypsy Schedule Analyzer. It's a 2-cost event. You make a run on R&D. If the run is successful, instead of accessing, you reveal cards one at a time from R&D until you reveal an agenda, and then that agenda gets added to HQ. Then the rest of the cards get shuffled back into R&D. This is probably the card that inspired indexing, and I think indexing just should have been a better card throughout the history of the game, but was so massively shut down by shuffle effects that you could use during paid ability windows, especially Jackson Howard, which is easily the most played card on the corp side of the game, but also nowadays with things like Executive Boot Camp as well. I'm all for run events that encourage running on multiple servers. And this, I would argue, is more tactically interesting than indexing. With indexing, you pretty much just get them in a position where their R&D is soft, and you just hammer away on it. This kind of requires both of those two centrals to be soft, or at least you able to get into both servers. And I think that's more interesting, if kind of weaker. But this is definitely better in some respects because you're looking at far more than 5 cards. If there's only one agenda left in the deck, you definitely get it with this thing. For that reason, I'd like to add in a little effect that allows the corp to trash any of the cards that they choose out of the revealed cards. That would just make it a little more interactive. The corp would have a little bit of say in the matter. And this, to me, is pretty obviously a Shaper card. This, alongside Maker's Eye, could be really, really strong, and I think it would function in the way that indexing was kind of intended to work, and I think kind of has worked occasionally, especially out of Kate, but this to me is just a much more interesting card tactically because it requires both of those two centrals. The next card should make all of you power gamers happy out there. This is World Domination. It's an agenda, it's 12 advancement requirement, and it's worth 3 points, but you get 4 additional points when you score it. The one-shot win agenda is something that we already have in the form of Project Beal, and pretty much the only way to do that is with psychographics. This is going to be kind of the same thing, where it's going to be basically impossible to score this thing without some sort of combo. And I think this would help the power shutdown combo decks because they would only have to score this one agenda rather than having to score several of them. It would also be kind of an interesting card just in Weyland because they already have big agendas that they like to over-advance over time, and having some single score agenda, once this gets into the like 8-9 advancement counters, your opponent really needs to know what this is because you might just win the game. This is just a flavorful and sweet card to add to the Weyland card pool. I don't know if it'd really be that good. I think you'd pretty much only play it in like power shutdown combo or something like that. I'd really like to see these one-shot win agendas, and this is an interesting way to do it because it only counts as 3 for your 20 required agendas, but if you manage to score one of them, you just win the game outright. The next card is a program. It's called Schematic Search Engine. It's 2 to play, it's 1 MU. Whenever you access cards from HQ, expose all of the corp's installed cards. Let's face it, expose effects suck. I really like them in the game for new players, but almost all of the cards that actually expose things are just drastically underpowered. And that isn't to say that we haven't seen some interesting ideas with expose effects, especially Silhouette, I think was a good idea. Nowadays, Drive-By is definitely a really good idea because the expose effect is not the primary thing that the card does, the trashing is. So I think if you're going to make a pure expose effect, it needs to be absolutely bonkers. It needs to be really strong. And something like this, where you get to expose a ton of cards and you can do it more than once, would be huge. So this is obviously a criminal card, and I would also make this hardware rather than a program, just because I don't see why this would need to take up your MU. And frankly, this card doesn't really seem that strong to me, even though it has a lot of potential. This is also interesting because it makes the anti-expose effects a little more viable. If this was something that you could anticipate running into, putting like a psychic field or something like that in play would be really a huge liability for the runner. They have to expose all your cards, so they're going to have to also expose that psychic field and get hit for the damage maybe. The next card is a 5-for-3 agenda called Theorem Proof. If the runner accesses Theorem Proof, he or she does not score it, but instead may install it as a 2MU program with the ability click to score theorem proof, but it's removed from the game if it leaves play in any other way. I've talked in the past about how big agendas are usually bad. This would be another difficult to steal 5 for 3 that I think would fit the best in the HB faction. We need to clean up the rules a little bit on this card. First of all, I think the remove from game thing could be kind of abusable, and I just think it's generally a bad idea to have these agendas removed from the game like that. So I would instead have it whenever theorem proof is uninstalled, you add it to HQ. I would also have it installed face down as the 2MU program. We don't have any rules for corp cards being installed face down as runner cards, so I think this might be a way that we could accommodate this. It's face down as a 2MU program. I also think that it could just be a little bit better, having it be 2 clicks instead of just 1 to steal theorem proof. The big idea here is if the runner is cramped on MU, if they have their full rig installed, it's going to be really hard to steal this thing. They're going to have to trash existing programs or maybe play more cards that add to their MU. And I think that's just generally an interesting area of the design space, pushing rig destruction more as an MU reduction rather than just outright trashing things. We saw that with like Bad Times, which is just a direct reprint from the original game, but that's just really not good enough, and I think something like this would be really scary to run into as the runner. It's still very possible to steal it, you're still getting 3 points from it, but it's going to have this tricky thing where you really just need to anticipate this 2MU requirement. Next up is the card that I'm actually most surprised we haven't seen reprinted. This is Private LDL Access. It's a zero-cost event. Make a run on HQ. If the run is successful, do not access cards on HQ. Instead, treat it as a successful run on R&D. So this is sort of a one-shot sneak door type effect, but instead of it being archives to HQ, it's HQ to R&D. And this to me just would make a ton of sense as a criminal run event. I think you could also make this cost something, just because I think the effect is easily going to be worth it. Being able to sidestep the really taxing R&D, like if you make a bunch of runs on R&D and they put like toll booth or just some monstrous ice there, now you can switch the threat back over to HQ, which is something that is very criminal to begin with. I'd really like to see some of these tricky run events that allow us to manipulate the way that the centrals interact, and I think that this is just a really cool way to do that. I don't think this card is fantastic, but I think it's good enough, and I think there's quite a few decks that would want to play 1 or 2 of these as sort of a backdoor entrance to R&D, especially late in the game when you have multiple like interfaces or things like that installed. Next up is another agenda, and it follows suit with original Netrunner in that it has an absolutely horrible name. This is Please Don't Choke Anyone. It's a 4 for 2, it's Gray Ops. For each 1 damage you successfully do, you may instead prevent that damage to put a PDCA counter on Please Don't Choke Anyone. Then you can remove the counter to gain an action, and you can use that only during your turn and only once per turn. There's a lot of changes and cleanup that would be required for this to be a good card. First of all, I would make this 3 for 1. And second of all, I would make it so that it was just any amount of damage put 1 counter rather than 1 counter per damage. Seems a little outrageous that you would be able to hit them for like 3 damage and then get 3 actions over the next few turns. This to me seems like a big opportunity as a 3 for 1 for PE. This would just be an incredible like fast advanced sort of tool for PE, especially since the ID itself would trigger the damage effect. So you would be able to score an agenda, get the counter, and then be able to fast score another agenda the next turn. And that's really powerful. This is really the type of fast scoring, fast advance mechanism that I would like. It's difficult to use. It's going to require other cards. You're going to have to be able to hit them for damage. If they prevent the damage somehow, you're not going to get the counter. So there's a little more interaction than, like Astroscript or something like that. And as a 3-for-1, especially in Jinteki, it's going to be pretty hard to build like a really, really heavy, fast advanced deck with Brain Trust and 1 Philotic Entanglement. You maybe have Medical Breakthrough as well. I think in general this would fit best in a PE, like 1,000 cut style, poke 'em for damage. It would give you a way to score out or threaten to score out later in the game, or it might even just give you a few extra clicks you can use for your economy. I think this is the type of 3-for-1 that the game could use, and I really wish the designers would consider putting more powerful effects on 3-for-1s. They've been doing that a little bit. The future is now is definitely a step in the right direction. We've started to see better 3-for-1s, and I'd like to see that carry over to some powerful engine type card like this. Next up is an event called Pirate Broadcast. It's one to play. Make a run on each server. Score 1 agenda point if all runs are successful. Forego your next action if any of the runs are not successful. Here's another card that's going to take some cleanup. First of all, making a run on all of the servers, that's good enough. You don't need this agenda point thing as well. So I would instead make it, first of all, only make a run on every remote server. And I would change the way that was worded a little bit so that it would be make a run on a remote server that has not been run this turn. Then if it's unsuccessful, you add it to your score area as -1 agenda points. And you repeat that effect until you either run all the remote servers or a run is unsuccessful. So the big idea here is that it's a run event that lets you run a whole bunch of servers, and I think we can immediately understand why that type of card would be awesome. That would be really, really good against NEH. It would be pretty good against Engineering the Future as well. Some of the shell game Jintekis, it might be useful if rather dangerous. I think all around, something that let you run a bunch of remote servers for 1 click would be a good card for the game. I definitely don't like the idea of it letting you run multiple centrals because of its interaction with things like quests completed and notoriety. So I think this would be a much more interesting card if it was only locked on remotes. This to me seems pretty obviously like an Anarch card, and you'd probably want to give it a reasonable influence cost just to make sure that it's not in like virtually every deck. This is actually, I think, a pretty tricky card to use, but certainly one that could be really powerful. And I also think that adding it to the score area as -1 agenda points would be a way to open up things like Data Dealer or other forfeit agenda effects to make those a little more viable. The last card I would only consider with a nerf, and this is Corporate Downsizing. It's a 3-for-2, it's Gray Ops. When you score it, show to the runner any number of agenda cards in HQ, and then you gain credits equal to twice the combined agenda points of the cards, shuffle them into R&D. This would have to be pretty drastically reworked for it to not be way too strong. But let's first of all talk about why this effect is a good effect for the game. I think that a lot of people have been talking about replacing Jackson Howard post-rotation, and we're going to need some Jackson Howard-esque effect. And my main suggestion for that is to distribute that type of effect among many different cards. So I think it would be much better if we had the Jackson Howard sort of shuffling agendas back into your deck. If that was just a much more mainstream effect. If there were just more cards that did that, instead of it being all reliant on this one card that every deck plays. In my core set neutral video, I suggested a piece of ice that I made up called Gatherer, which is again on this same lines. The whole idea is that we should have more ways to reshuffle agendas back into our deck. So in the interest of that, I would make Corporate Downsizing a 2-for-1 for Weyland. and I would have it only reveal one agenda, either from HQ or archives. And then instead of the twice the agenda points thing, I would just have it credits equal to the advancement requirement of the agenda. The big thing about advancement requirement instead of points is that for the most part, you're looking at 1, 2, or 3 with agenda points. Whereas with the advancement requirement, it can go from 2, 3, 4, 5. If you played government takeover, maybe the world domination we looked at earlier, you would have some engine in your deck when you scored this. It would be a lot better than hostile takeover, but that would require you to play virtually unscorable agendas in your deck. And I think that using advancement requirement as the way to get the credits, or just generally focusing on advancement requirement rather than points, is a way to privilege these higher end agendas that are virtually unscorable. So the thing I like about this rework is it not only has a pseudo Jackson Howard effect, but it also encourages you to play quote unquote bad big agendas, and I think that's something we can agree that the game could use. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly had a lot of fun putting it together. The main takeaway here is that the design space in Netrunner is huge, and there's still plenty of great ideas and different ways to explore the card space left in this game. Original Netrunner had a lot of bad ideas, but it also had some good ones, and I think that there's still quite a few good ideas that we could take from the game, and in this video I tried to pick 10 of my favorites. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for some more Netrunner stuff.